I've been a gardener for most of my life. I've gradually worked up a roster of clients over the years. The majority are elderly residents who cannot maintain their gardens anymore due to ill health or mobility. I've had some customers for almost 20 years, and I treat them as family as they do to me. They will usually recommend me to their friends or neighbors. I recently got recommended and took on a rather large, ongoing job for a luxury retirement village. It was perfect as work was running a little dry recently and I was struggling to fill each week. The village consisted of around 30 bungalows and the surrounding grounds were absolutely huge. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere and surrounded by farmers' fields. It would take a few full days a week to maintain the grounds. The residents ranged in the amount of care they required, and the village provided assisted living. The first few weeks were pretty mundane, and I barely even saw any of the residents. I would occasionally notice them staring at me through the windows, but I never had a face-to-face interaction. I was there for most of the day, and it was bright and sunny outside at the moment, so I figured I would have met at least a few of them. The first time I actually spoke to one of the residents was a few weeks after I started. I was mowing the grass one morning when I heard a harrowing screech coming from behind me. The sound almost deafened me, even over the sound of the lawnmower. I immediately turned around to see a sweet, older lady standing on the steps of her house waving at me. I turned the mower off and moved towards her to introduce myself. I introduced myself as the new gardener and gestured my hand out towards her. She just remained there waving, but not at me, I noticed. She was waving directly over my shoulder and not looking at me at all. Then all of a sudden, she said, "Okay, I'll go back inside now," and turned around and went back inside of her house. I turned around, but nobody was there. I have seen some strange behavior in my time, and this was definitely not the weirdest thing to happen to me. I brushed it off, and I continued my day. The following days went by as usual, with no contact with the residents other than the occasional peeping through the curtains at me. The next time I had any contact was the first time I met Jeffrey. He was an older, blind man who was the only one of the residents who would occasionally sit outside on his porch. He would just sit there, all alone. He would barely shift in his movement, and I never bothered him as I figured he didn't want to be bothered. I was clipping some roses one day in a hanging flower pot at the side of his house when I heard him speak. "I'm Jeffrey, and I have a secret," he said. I turned around and introduced myself. "I'm Jeffrey, and I have a secret," he said again as I got closer. I figured I would humor him and asked him what the secret was. "I can't tell you, it's a secret." I was a mixture of disturbed and confused at this point. The way he spoke was almost like that of a small child whimpering some silly anecdote in my ear. I just wanted to get back to work, and so I did. I began to cut the roses before I heard him speak once again. "Okay, he said I can tell you." He paused before raising his voice in more of an adult tone. "He's behind you." "Who's behind me?" I said while looking over my shoulder. And no one was there, of course. "Okay, I'll go back inside now," he then said before walking back inside of his house. I was a little more disturbed this time, and I decided to finish up at the retirement village so I could take a little break from my place. I hastily drove off and went over to another client to regain a sense of normalcy. I hastily drove off and went on to another client to regain a sense of calmness. It was a Friday afternoon, and I decided to work a little later as then I could take the Saturday off. I had planned Saturday afternoon, and I didn't want to have to get up and work in the morning. I finished up the job at around 7 p.m. and it was getting darker, and I went over to the van to call my wife to tell her that I would be home soon. I rummaged through the van looking for my phone, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Dang it, I shouted to myself as I realized that I had left it back at the retirement home. I had placed it on one of the pots the second time that I had approached Jeffrey. I was in such a rush to get out of there that I had forgotten it. It was in the complete opposite direction from the house, and I didn't want to have to trek down there in the morning. It was not too far from where I was at the time, so I just decided to go back and pick it up then. As I approached the long and winding road towards the retirement home, it was as if the night sky instantly darkened. By the time I had reached the property, it was almost pitch black outside. There were no streetlights, and the only illumination was the headlights of my van. It was just all in my mind, I told myself. I parked up my van and grabbed a flashlight from the back. I slowly walked over the cobbled driveway, every step louder than the last. You could hear a pin drop in the silence that engulfed me. I flashed my light towards the houses and stopped in my tracks, scared to move another inch. The residents, all of the residents, were outside on the front of their homes. They were all standing there, waving off in the distance. They did not falter, and they didn't even move as I ran back to my van. I started up the engine and I got out of there. I was not bothered about picking up my phone. I explained everything to my wife once I got back home, but she felt that I was just tired and overreacting. I tried to convince her, but it fell on deaf ears. I was in two minds whether to return back there on Monday morning, but at the moment, I could not afford not to. I had lost quite a few clients over the years, and I had barely even raised my prices. I always felt terrible raising prices on my elderly customers who I considered family. But this new job was different. The pay was at least triple what I used to earn in a full week for just a few days of work. I was being paid directly by the company who owned the village, and I had no problems on that end. This job allowed us to afford some luxury in life. We also had two younger children that we had to support. I turned up Monday morning and everything was back to normal. I had retrieved my phone and it was exactly where I had left it. The residents were all inside of their homes, and although the staring out of the windows seemed to be worse, at least they were not outside. I went through the day with no issues, and although I could not have explained what happened, I tried to ignore it. The same thing happened yesterday. There was no issue, and even Jeffrey wasn't sitting outside on his porch to whisper creepy little messages into my ear. I did notice the staring had become worse, though. Throughout the day, almost all of the residents at one time or another had caught staring at me. That was the least of my worries, though. I did manage to catch one of the carers on her way out of one of the houses. I had not actually seen any carers before, which I had not even thought about it until I saw her. I had not seen any relatives or visitors either, only the residents. She seemed to be in quite a rush, and she was pale in the face. I introduced myself and asked her if she had noticed anything strange about the village. She began to look around as if she was being watched and asked me to walk over to her car. She seemed to regain more semblance of calm the further she moved away from the building. I would just go do your job and not ask any questions. Just be careful about some of the residents, she said. I asked her about Jeffrey and the older lady who I had first met, and she began to breathe heavier, frantically looking over her shoulder. Be careful of him. He's blind, but he sees things. Not in a way you or I could understand. Oh God, I've said too much. This is my last day here, and I recommend it is yours as well. I asked her what she meant, but she shook her head and got in her car and drove off. I began to panic, but all I could think about was the money. I was about to book myself and my wife our first holiday in 5 years, and I had to make this work. I would not get an opportunity like this again. I got there in the morning at my usual time, and everything seemed to be whatever I would call a normal day at this place. The residents would stare occasionally, and I would get the occasional wave, but that was just fine by me. The afternoon hit, and I was weeding around the corner of Jeffrey's house. He was now sitting outside on his porch, and I heard him whispering occasionally, but I decided to ignore it. I finally reached the front of his house and heard him humming to himself while drawing a picture. He was manically brushing strokes onto the page with his right arm while the rest of his body remained lifeless. "Do you want to see it?" he said as I walked past him. I felt rude to ignore him, so I politely declined and wished him a good rest of his day. "But it's important and you should see it," he said. I begrudgingly accepted as he held out the picture in front of him. It was a drawing of me in that very moment. I mean, it was exactly me, down to the facial expression I was pulling right then. The detail was astounding. The shape of my eyes, the length and style of my hair, even the scar above my eye when I cut my head open when I was younger. The surroundings were almost immaculate. It was black and white, but the flowers, the sky, everything was perfect. It looked more like a photo than a drawing. I looked closer at the drawing and noticed that just above my shoulder there was a black smudge. I could vaguely make out some features, but not much. It was over a foot taller than me, and on second inspection, it looked to have the shape of a human. It was difficult to make out as the drawing was all black and white, though. "How did you draw that? I thought you were, and what is above my shoulder?" I said. "That's him. He said I could show you him now." I slowly turned my head as Jeffrey began maniacally laughing in front of me. Then laughter began to bellow throughout the entire village. I spun the rest of my head around, but there was nothing behind me. I turned around and angrily grabbed my tools and exited the village. I could hear the sounds of laughter still as I drove away. I got home this evening and decided not to tell my wife what had happened. I immediately went to go and take a shower when she called out to me. "What's that black smudge all down the back of your shirt, hon?"